Who has had a good week, Dominic?
It's been a good week for the Baltic states after they finally disconnected their electricity grid from the Russian network over the weekend, cutting ties with Putin or electricity wires. Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania are now connected to the European Union's electricity grid.
Woohoo!
Are you excited, Katie?
So excited.
Good.
I mean, I guess I might be a bit excited if I actually knew what an electricity grid is. I have to confess. It's one of those things that people say as if it's obvious, but I'm not sure it is. Like, what is it really?
I imagine you're not the only person who doesn't really know what an electricity grid is. So, I'll tell you. It's basically the backbone of the electricity system. An electricity grid is a large network of the power plants, transmission lines, and distribution centers that ensure that electricity gets sent to the places it needs to be used.
Okay, so it's like the whole system.
Exactly, yeah. It's the big word for how everything works.
Thank you.
And up until last weekend, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania were part of the so-called BRELL power grid, which is a power grid that is run rather uncomfortably for the Baltic states from Moscow. BRELL stands for the 5 countries that were up until this weekend on that grid. So Belarus, Russia, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania.
It's kind of strange that this is happening so late in the day, because I thought EU countries hadn't been buying any electricity from Russia since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine back in 2022.
Yes, it's true. No EU countries have been buying electricity from Russia, although, of course, we know there is still some gas being bought from Russia, but that's a different thing. The Baltic states on this network also haven't been buying electricity from Russia or Belarus since May 2022, but they had been using this Soviet-era electricity grid, which meant they were synchronized with Russia, even though they weren't actually buying any electricity from them. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Good.
And presumably that must have been quite risky, like having your whole electricity system hooked up to Russia's.
Yeah, I mean, Russia is a hostile nation for these Baltic states now. And we know that Russia is absolutely not afraid of using the limitation of energy as a geopolitical tool in its hybrid warfare toolbox. From what I read, in theory, Russia could have done some damage to the electricity supply in the Baltic states if it had wanted to, because the electrical grid was synchronized with a Russian-controlled thing called the integrated power system.
Okay.
Stay with me. In normal words, that means that dispatch centers in Moscow were in charge of maintaining electric frequency stability.
Mm-hmm.
And if Russia had decided, I realize it's kind of technical language. But basically, if Russia had decided to mess around with that, it could have created instability or even blackouts on the grid.
Okay.
So this move away from the Russian grid was about removing that vulnerability, but it was more than that. It was also about modernizing the electricity grid in the Baltic states, because the Soviet-era BRELL grid is apparently quite outdated and prone to technical problems, which the Baltic states had not much control over. So that's all why this past weekend, these 3 countries were really celebrating integrating further with their fellow EU neighbours, joining the EU's common electricity market and opening up more opportunities for a broader mix of electricity sources.
Okay, seems like this is the right move all round. Is there any downside to disconnecting from the Russian electricity grid and connecting to the European one?
Well, maybe this isn't like an immediate downside, but it's a concern, and that is that Russia could decide to retaliate in some way, try to get revenge for these countries leaving BRELL. There have been all these cases of suspected Russian sabotage lately in the Baltic Sea over the past year and a half. 11 cables have been cut in the Baltic Sea, and there is concern that Russia could ramp up this cable cutting and or retaliate with cyber attacks on the grid. The EU and the Baltic states say that they are well prepared for any potential retaliation, but these ongoing attempts to interfere with the EU's energy supply are a really serious concern for Europe. And yeah, there have been calls from clever analysts like Szymon Kardasz at the European Council on Foreign Relations.
Our former guest.
Indeed, to increase investment in Baltic energy infrastructure to strengthen the resilience of Baltic energy security. I guess the other downside, if it can be seen as a downside, was that this was an incredibly expensive project, as you might imagine.
Yeah, how much does it cost to unplug all of the wires and connect the new ones?
It's thought to have cost about 1.6 billion euros.
Wowza.
But the good news is there's no indication that these countries joining the EU's grid will see any rise in their price of electricity. If anything, there's actually a hope that the electricity prices will lower towards the end of this year in those countries as some new renewables come online. I think it's genuinely good news, although one other maybe messy thing that happened over the past few weeks as the Baltic states were trying to decouple from Russia has been this campaign of disinformation, presumably organized by Russia, which included leaflets in Russian being spread around apartment blocks in some of these areas, suggesting that people were going to lose access to their electricity and that all prices were going to rise. But when it came to it, the transition went really smoothly over the weekend. There was no problem with continuity of electricity. And actually, there was this weird 24 hours after the three countries disconnected from Russia and before they connected to the EU system. So for 24 hours, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were a little energy island, something that will probably never happen again.
A mini grid. That is very exciting.
Do you want to know a random exciting fact about the electricity grid of the European Union?
Sure, I do, always.
It is the second largest electricity grid in the world.
Oh, after?
After, yeah, where would you think the biggest is?
China?
Yes, it is. And it includes now all of the European Union countries and also some non-EU countries, Moldova, Ukraine, and Turkey. Are you bored by my facts about the European Union's electricity grid?
No, I'm learning many things.
Good.
My one question is, why didn't this happen sooner? I mean, we have been in this extremely hostile relationship with Russia for a good long while now. It seems kind of weird that it took so long to cut the wires and connect the new ones.
Yeah, well, it's been a long time coming. The agreement for the three Baltic states to join the EU's grid was approved back in 2007.
Oh, so way before the invasion then.
Exactly, yeah. So they've been wanting this to happen for a long time, but it's a huge project. And it did get accelerated in 2022 after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And in the end, it actually finished 10 months ahead of schedule.
Something in Europe happening ahead of schedule?
Indeed, it's a miracle.
Amazing.
The EU and the leaders of the Baltic states really wanted to make something of this momentous occasion, marking it as a blow for Russia and a sign of EU solidarity with Ukraine and with each other. So they actually organized this really flashy event in Vilnius last weekend to celebrate what they called Baltic Energy Independence Day.
Whoop, whoop.
And I'm sending you a clip now, Katie. Can you click on this link and just watch the beginning of this video?
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow, lasers. Oh my God. What's happening? I feel like I'm at a Daft Punk concert.
It's really quite impressive, isn't it? The light design is phenomenal.
They seem to have organised a full-on rave, but all of the attendees are really boring-looking politicians.
It's really boring politicians, but watching something that looks a bit like the Eurovision Song Contest set in a Star Wars movie, but for lovers of energy security.
Love it.
Honestly, I kind of love that they organised this event, and I was quite surprised. I don't see the EU doing things like this very often, and I wondered whether this is what we need.
For every piece of boring legislation that we pass, there should be a laser show.
Totally agreed. I'm kind of tempted to do a whole reaction video with you where we go through that, because there are some amazing, there's a bit where an electric guitarist plays Ode to Joy very dramatically with huge speakers. And there's also a moment where the leaders of the countries all stand together with these lights that turn on, and it's very Star Wars and lightsabery. But there were also some boring speeches from politicians, which brought the mood down a bit, honestly. But they are saying encouraging, nice things about integration. And Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, announced some plans to try and strengthen Europe's energy security. But yeah, for this week, I want to give good week to the Baltic states, who were occupied by Soviet forces until the 90s. And now finally managed to cut some of those final literal cords to Russia. Ursula von der Leyen said, "This is freedom, freedom from threats, freedom from blackmail."
Good job, Baltic friends.